starting this off, okay?
Okay, I'm going to go ahead and introduce our Scholar Activist series, and Antonio López is going to be kicking it off, I'm proud to say. This series features scholars who attended Duke, studied Islam and Arabic or Middle East language and or Middle Eastern studies. They're former students that have gone on to do truly unique, interesting, and important work. But at the same time, each of these scholars has been fiercely committed to social justice issues, organizing towards envisioning a better, more just university, community, nation, and world. This series is intended to highlight their contributions and their scholarship. But I also wanted these emerging scholars to talk about how their work at Duke helped shape and inform their life paths. I am honored today to introduce Antonio López, who has been a fierce advocate for rights of Muslims, Latinx, and African American communities, an eloquent and moving poet, a provocative scholar, and a committed student of Arabic and Islam. Antonio was born and raised in East Palo Alto, California, and at Duke, he received his degree in Global Cultural Studies and African American Studies. After graduation, Antonio completed a master's in fine arts at Rutgers University with a specialization in poetry. In 2018, he received a Marshall Scholarship, choosing to study at the University of Oxford, where he received a master's in philosophy and modern Middle East studies. At Oxford, he was also the poetry editor for the Oxford Review of Books. Antonio's first collection of poetry, Gentification, meaning gentrification with gente, will be published through 4-Way Books. That's for the gringos out there, right? Will be published through 4-Way Books in September 2021. Gentification was awarded the 2019 Levis Prize in Poetry. Tony was also the recipient of the 2019 Katherine Bakeless Nelson Award in Poetry at the 2019 Bread Loaf Writers Conference. He was also runner-up for the inaugural Palette Poetry Spotlight Award in 2019. He has widely published both poetry and nonfiction and has received numerous fellowships to attend writers' workshops. Welcome, Antonio. And I will also have to just self-identify as a gringa, just for the record, because I want, just in today's like climate, I just want to say I'm a gringa. I'm a gringa. I'm pure gringa. Sorry.
It's all good. It's all good. Good afternoon, everyone, or good evening if you're on the East Coast like Elijah. I hope y'all are doing much better than California is, inshallah. I hope y'all are just safe. Like, first and foremost, that your families are being taken care of, that you are eating right, you're drinking. I'm more than happy to talk about the knowledge that I've had at Duke. And really, I mean, I'm a first generation college student, I should say. Education has always been the vehicle for mobility for me, for success for me and my family. The first time that my parents came to Duke was actually for my graduation. And so for me, it's really moving to every time I come back to Duke to give a talk, especially to folks like Julie, like Ellen, who are so kindly receiving me open arms. It's always a homecoming, and it's always a reflection for me of how much I've come. But I want y'all to know that I'm bringing my family in this space, my village in this space, my community in this space, and I welcome you all to do the same. And so I just want to start it off by giving that blessing to all you all, and I hope that your families are just taking care of each other. So this lecture, or semi-lecture, I was telling Ellen and Julie that, you know, as you may or may not know, I'm also running for city council in my hometown of East Palo Alto. And so a lot of this talk won't have the kind of same register of academia, because I've been talking to tenant leaders, I've been talking to homeless folks, I've been talking to folks on the street. And so I'm sure that also is inflecting the way of speaking. And that's also the urgency in which I write this. So here's the lecture. The ink of the poet, rewriting the wretched as sacred. As I'm sure all of you Islamic study buffs may intuit, this talk takes its inspiration from the famous hadith narrated by a prophet, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, who said, "The ink of the scholar is holier than the blood of a martyr." Admittedly, I actually first heard these words not as an Islamic text, but a hip-hop intro. Yes, the opening words to Lupe Fiasco's American Terrorist, who in turn rewrote the quote as, "The ink of a scholar is worth 1,000 times more than the blood of a martyr." I want to say like in the year 2009, that's when I first heard it. This gives you an idea of how deeply Black American culture, but also Islamic principles has inflected and influenced my tongue, my ways of thinking, years before I ever stepped foot in a small Salafi masjid in Durham, North Carolina, and took my Shahada, was 2015. It is also worth mentioning that this hadith is attributed to a number of the Sahaba or the Prophet's companions, but not himself. Moreover, their isnads, which is the Arabic word for support, are weak and flimsy or fabricated. To provide just one example, the hadith was narrated by Ibn Abdul Bar, whose isnad includes Ismail ibn Abi Zayd, of whom Ibn Hibban said he's a charlatan. Get into that. Side note though, I think it's sort of beautiful, a delight even, that the authoritative text of the second most popular religion in the world is derived in essence by a game of telephone, and whose cellular plan has the most reliable network, and it's just an analogy. But this talk isn't about scrutinizing the strength of a hadith's claim. It's not even about getting into the theological quandaries about privileging scholarship over physical combat in the name of faith. I begin with this quote as my lens into the lecture to emphasize to you all that for me, writing is first and foremost a spiritual act. Poetry to me is a meditation on those cultural subjects, from artifacts to entire populations, and creating meaning through that artifying. It is also a political act to refuse to ignore that which is too often ignored, that we often take as ordinary, whether we talk about the homeless man sitting on the bus stop outside the liquor store, or how the leaves on the orange tree in my house are speckled by the recent ash of a few days ago. So let's start. This lecture is about poetry, so I'm going to intersperse this talk with a few poems. And I've been going through different craft lectures, and so I think it's worth chewing on what poetry can offer us. And so when I'm talking about poems, I really want to get into the nuts and bolts about how precisely we humanize people, and what are the tools that we as artists use to create dignity and shed light on populations that have always been set aside. So I'm going to be reading some poems from my forthcoming book, Hintification, as well as some new work where you can tell that the attitude and tone has shifted. But let's start with a short poem, one that talks about the homeboys of my youth, right? The Black and Latino boys who once filled my life and who I'm honestly not sure where they've gone now. This poem is called The Disciples of San Mateo County, California. Actually, can I share the screen? Can I show you all the poem? Yeah? All right, let me do that. Okay, ignore the post-it notes. The Disciples of San Mateo County, California. And God said to Juventino, perform ablution over the bathroom sink. Press the cold metal with novice palms. Stretch out your double white tee, the cotton bullet-proof vest, where upon stepping in the schoolyard, you'll face juvenile punches. Brace the iron gates with knockoff Cortezes. Cuff your sagging Dickies by the ankles. Saunter to the cracked voices of boys who laugh without a tag for their torsos. Unzip your brother's fur jacket and take father's flask. Drink from his patron. Shadow box the heavy gavel swings with swigs of your own. Cleanse yourself in liquor's kerosene. Let flammable spirits purge all nerves. To be an acolyte, embalmed in hair gel, worshiping the altars cordoned off in caution tape, is sainthood. So poetry is about still, thank you very much. I'm getting ahead of myself, thank y'all. So poetry is about stillness, right? It's about slowing down the capitalist clock to say, hey, what is this that you're holding, that you're observing? And what does it tell you about the larger human condition, right? So let's take a look at that first couplet of this poem, right? Or I guess hear me say it. And God said to Juventino, perform ablution over the bathroom sink. When I was a middle school kid at Ronald Edison McNair, the Latino boys would often lower their heads under the faucet and slick their hair back as if gelling it. Of course, at 11, 12, 13 years old, I didn't think twice about this. You just think, oh, okay, like Juventino is just trying to get his pretty boy on again. But actually, given the toxic masculinity that's rampant in our culture, I think it's funny that machismo permits this small act of brown boys to beautify themselves, of tenderness, akin to a peacock unfurling its plumage. But once I converted to Islam, and I saw young Somali boys standing over the small plastic stools in the masjid bathroom in London, or the small black boys in Durham, North Carolina, their fathers holding the bucket as beads of water trailed down their head, I realized the holiness of this act. The poem rifles through the speaker's memory the ruins of a rough past, and so retroactively sacralizes what was otherwise a mundane thing. You know, Juventino just trying to get his pretty boy on. But there's a tension inherent in the poem, the proverbial line that it's towing. On the one hand, the poem carries as its ethos the re-examination of these boys of color in a Title I school, not as delinquents, but as disciples, the followers of a cold logic of violence, drinking, and brotherhood. On the other hand, the poem is at pains to not romanticize, to not embellish to the point of fetish. Hence, I want to take a moment to study the line breaks. One of my dearest mentors in poetry once told us at workshop that the energy of a poem is sustained through its line breaks. Hence, a rule of thumb sometimes proffered to starting poets is to end your lines with verbs. Let's take the inventory of the words at the end of each line. And I'm going to say them so y'all know. Sink, palms, juvenile, gates, sagging, saunter, laugh, torsos, kerosene. I want to now focus on a select few. Let's start with the third line. It reads, stretch out your double white tee, the cotton bullet proof vest. So the line break is at cotton bullet. That forces the reader to pause and hopefully truly think about the transformation of play. The bundles of Hanes, Fruit of the Loom, or Kirkland signature shirts our parents would purchase for us, that once they touched our chest became armor. The reader is hit with the stark contrast of cotton, white, flesh-like, soft to the touch, with bullet, hard, metallic, ungiving as it pierces. The poem is, in other words, therefore, is trafficking these tensions. And as it does so, it opts to create neologisms. It creates compound words that embody this duality of the damned and the deified. The cotton bulletproof vest, that whole thing, the mythic but sadly false assumption that touting a certain color or uniform makes Juan or one invincible. Shortly after, we have the compound term, schoolyard, which is an echo to prison that is reinforced by the phrase that follows, you'll face juvenile. And again, we see the poem employ the line break as a site of meditation, the liminal space in poetry where the two worlds can come together. It is also no coincidence that the phrase, you'll face juvenile, mimics judicial syntax, a nod to the headlines we're numb to defendants of color facing years in prison. And having created the anticipation, the poem then deviates from it and follows with juvenile punches. And now the reference goes from figurative to literal. We can visualize, in other words, the beatdown, whether those may be from a friendly game of wall ball or a gang initiation is an unsolved question. The poem is agile. It remixes without necessarily telling the reader conventional images or objects, and then reshapes them while still leaving a trace of the old. Does that make sense? So we're having these layers in the poem where we have juvenile, but then it goes punches, or it goes cotton bullet, and then it says cotton bulletproof vest. So the poem is creating, playing with cliches we already know, but then once it creates anticipation, it moves it, and that has a kind of connotation. Think of the poem as a mural then, one that leaves fades of the paint of once was there before. Hence the next line, brace the iron gates. And gate is spelled at G-A-I-T-S. Through homophone, the audience may still hear, or in a metaphor of mural, see the iron gate, like the pearly gate. But the poem has added that new paint, that of the G-A-I-T, a person's manner of walking. And in the subcultures of Black and brown boys, the way that a homeboy walks is an act that's often a ritual. Think of, for example, sea walking for Crips or other cultures. The poem is enacting, therefore, a sleight of hand, deftly and quickly rechanging words in order to arrive at a similarity. The next poem, the poem reads after, shadow box the heavy gavel swings with swigs of your own. The swing of a judge's gavel is juxtaposed to the swig of the speaker, of a young boy who is presumably performing all these rites for the first time. The ablution of the third line has now alchemized to a liquor's cleansing, quote, a flammable spirit to purge all nerves. A boy's whole trajectory, how he went from washing his hair in a middle school sink to dousing his body in liquor, an ethnic effigy, is told in a dozen lines. And finally, the poem's climax, the promise of sainthood, the fame among street corners. Quote, to be an acolyte, embalmed in hair gel, worshiping the altars cordoned off in caution tape, is sainthood. I don't need to tell you how many times growing up that I passed by street corners laden in roses and votive candles and balloon streamers. And I'm going off script now, but this morning when I went for a run, I saw another one this morning on wisteria and camellia. And I don't say how many times I've seen balloon streamers and a portrait of a young boy in a school uniform. And yet part of the seduction of gang circles is the promise of brotherhood, of being taken under an older member's wing, of tutelage, of told that you are valued, that you are loved. The word canon is apt here, a term which can mean one of several things. One, an authoritative list of books accepted as Holy Scripture. Two, in the secular sense, of course, canon designates the sanctioned group of related works in literature. Its root is derived from the Greek canon with a K, which in its original usage denoted a straight rod that was later used by architects as a measuring stick for making straight lines. It was, in the most literal sense, the yardstick by which we measured greatness. In the Catholic Church, an institution which I need not tell you how dramatically has shaped what is now Latin America, to canonize is to make officially declare a person to be a saint, oftentimes done posthumously or when they're already dead. And so when I'm talking about Mexican boys or Latino boys who I no longer see, who are ghosts in my life, who some are no longer with us for reasons all but natural, a subject that as I write this dries my throat and begins to water my eyes, I am talking about canonizing these homeboys, my classmates, into American letters. The poem articulates a patrilineal violence, a rite of passage of our young Cubetino who is about to enter. This is an alternative Genesis, our Garden of Eden, where Adam is nowhere in sight. The poem's form is what we in the business call strophic, a group of verses that does not have a regular meter, AKA freestyle. The lines are compressed and stacked together. It resembles a biblical passage, wouldn't y'all say? In terms of my work's evolution, this is an early poem of mine. Poems like these were necessary for me to write, to let out of my system. And to be frank with everyone, there is still a tremendous deal of trauma I am still processing, of growing up in the inner city and witnessing these young boys getting caught up in deadly crimes. To drive the point home, let me share you all a brief anecdote. A couple months ago, I decided to run for city council of East Palo Alto, which I already told you, the hometown I write about in poems like I just shared. Last Saturday, I paid a visit to my old kindergarten teacher, Ms. Barragan, who I'm blessed to say still lives just a few blocks from me, to drop off a lawn sign. She proposed the idea that why don't we take a picture with her and her mother, Yolanda, who also worked for the Ravenswood district for 40 years. 40 years! She told me, this is what she said to me as I put on the lawn sign. Qué bueno que estás presentándote como candidato, Tony. Mira, tengo 40 años trabajando por la ciudad y gracias a Dios acabo de retirarme. 40 años. ¿Puedes imaginar cuántos niños han pasado por mis brazos? Sorry about that. Oh boy. Pardon the interruption. anticipated that. All right, where were we? Okay, so she says, qué bueno que estás presentándote como candidato. Mira, tengo 40 años trabajando por la ciudad y gracias a Dios acabo de retirarme. 40 años. ¿Puedes imaginar cuántos niños han pasado por mis brazos? Y por eso estoy tan bendecida. Muchos de mis niños han pasado a ser ingenieros, doctores, maestros, pero ustedes no saben, todos los niños también estas manos tuvieron que enterrar. Don't worry, I'm going to translate. Just want to keep you on suspense. Miss Yolanda, our matriarch of Latina educators here in East Palo Alto, told us, how great that you're running for city council, Tony. Look, I spent 40 years working for the city, and thanks be to God, I just retired. 40 years. You can imagine how many kids have passed my arms. And for this, I am so blessed. Many of my students have gone on to become engineers, doctors, teachers. But you also don't know how many kids these hands have had to bury. My poetry is Yolanda's hands at best, holding homeboys, or more precisely, my memory, desperate to honor while staying true to my perspective of them. Perhaps no other poem of mine embodies this metaphor more than the one titled Triptych of the Adobe Kata Army. It's a funky title, I admit, but I derived it from watching old clips of the Terracotta Army, the Chinese statues who to this day still guard Emperor Qing Shi Huang. Hope I didn't butcher that. I thought about the ways that folks must look at this spectacle, a UNESCO World Heritage Site. Then I thought about gentrification and how it's ruined my city. And I don't mean ruin like in a melodramatic way, like a teenage boy scoffing that the wind has ruined his hair. I mean ruin in a theoretical sense, a social political process of layering of things with buildings to the point of erasure. Here are a few lines of the poem. I'll share it with you, even though it's a few lines, and I'm gonna go back to it. Y'all enjoying the sharing? Is this helpful? All right. Triptych of the Adobe Kata Army. My fingers are desperate to unearth the ruins of my countrymen, only to find a Tesla on the second floor of our apartments, now a parking garage. The Amazon logo smirks above me like a biblical cloud. It's just the first part. Show the rest later. You see, part of tackling the issue of violence isn't just the turf wars, the colors the young boys tout. It is to understand the structural violence, the ruthless march to level all semblance of what once was your neighborhood, all in the name of development, of progress, of economic prosperity. Let me show you a picture. Another picture. So this is Donahoe Street, and I'm gonna go back and forth so I can read. This is Donahoe Street, arguably the last of the Whiskey Gulch, the historic strip of businesses, some 50 plus, that East Palo Alto boasted in its infancy as a city. It's my home. Here we had a meat market, a taco shop called El Galope, a Metro PCS, which we playfully call in those days Getro PCS, an urban clothing store called La Familia Discount. Side note, I always found that the brand Urban Outfitters is kind of funny because like urban is such a contradicting and unstable signifier. Like I don't see urban kids wearing Urban Outfitters. Like it should be like Suburban Outfitters. But anyways, that's a side note. And so above all, you know, and above these local retail shops were old apartment buildings, the tackiest green doors, faraway shots of fathers laying their feet on an old coffee table, their little boys banging on the TV to turn static to sound. And this is what I'm talking about. So you got the Metro PCS. This is Donahoe Street. This is like 5-minute drive from me. And you know, these are the apartment buildings up top. And then here's a little meat market. And then here's the other shot of that same meat market. And it doesn't look like much from that angle, but that was such a bustling part of East Palo Alto, and more importantly, it was run by folks of this community. I should say that nowadays, or as of a few years ago, developer called Sobrado bought it, and then they sold it to Amazon. And so now it's like a telecommunications logistics place. So every time I pass that, and even the way that the architecture is built, it's like the first floor is like way up high. And so you always have to look up to it. And it's this brick and mortar thing. And so, and when I talk about, you know, the Amazon logo smirking above me, it's because the freaking Amazon logo is on the third floor. And the Tesla is literally in the spots where these apartments used to be. And so again, like Ellen, Julie, y'all know I went to Duke, right? So as I was studying at Duke, this was happening, you know? And so when I'm talking about city council and I'm talking about rewriting the Wretched, it's like, it's also me just excavating and mining and understanding what can I do with this memory when things have been leveled. And so, you know, I thought a visual representation would be helpful to really drive home what's happening. So my poetry mourns. I mourn not just the bodies of human flesh, but of buildings. In my poems, home and homeboy mesh into one. I seek the former in the latter, hence home in the root of the name. To mourn these bricks is to mourn his life. All right, so let's read the poem, and then go back to sharing it, kind of like sharing. Makes me feel all professorial. Triptych of the Adobe Kata Army, East Palo Alto, circa 2000 AD. My fingers are desperate to unearth the ruins of my countrymen, only to find a Tesla on the second floor of our apartments, now a parking garage. The Amazon logo smirks above me like a biblical cloud. Out here, hooded saints toward the covenant of earthly silence, passed out zigzag leaflets to preach the gospel of skin. Whirling dervishes in long white tees bum rushed me at a bautizo, pressed against my lips a cholo chalice. My chest flushed at watching boys bronze into adobe kata, a driveway floodlight. The barrio's moon casted their bodies as they placed bets against the armors they carried. A fist tucked inside a hoodie, his knuckles spelling the names of ex-lovers, each letter tatted with a paper clip, cocked belt buckle whose colors shout to the block who he fucks with, until asphalt swallows him again, and Marias now mourn Jesus outside a sagging fence, wreathed his chain link with lit candles, cardboard signs saying, "We miss you," streamers without the heated balloon that promised flight. Consider the clothesline as a bandolier, slung over ruined soldiers whose uniformes still clung onto apartment balconies. Quien se dieron sus tierras to raise the wrinkled flags of blusas and neon vests. Consider this Aztec sacrifice. A father offers an empire his daily flesh, kneels on the melted tar of its tongue, winces at the body turned legal tender, all to nurse the newborn with this vision, una vida mejor. And so father cradled my head inside asphalt, prayed for our right to simply wait. Thank you very much. I appreciate Lattice Jazz hands. Thanks, everyone. As we all may or may not know, thank you. As we all may or may not know, Jesus. A triptych is an art painting divided into 3 sections, or 3 carved panels hinged together, then can be folded shut or displayed open. The middle panel is typically the largest, and it's flanked by 2 smaller related works. Its origin, what the lofty theorists might call its genealogy, is derived from early Christian art, initially used for private devotional use during the Byzantine period. And now it adorns churches and cathedrals. The triptych is therefore a cornerstone form of religious iconography. And so the poem therefore appropriates this form, the saintly aura it's garnered over the centuries, and halos it over my city, the rubbled ruin of it. If the previous disciples' poem that I read was a bullet of a stanza, brief and short-lived, this poem in its tercettes, or 3-line stanzas, weaves and grieves and weaves, patiently braiding like a black mother to her child's hair. Whereas the previous poem, here, the speaker is ostensibly retelling the story of place and people that are no longer here, hence the past tense. We see the speaker's willingness to participate, to drink, quote unquote, the cholo chalice. There isn't immolation or cleansing oneself in liquor's Karen scene. Here, the scene is more festive, a kickback in front of someone's driveway. Nevertheless, the scene is just as ceremonial. The speaker isn't retelling the voice of God, distant and stoic like before. Here he is moved by the display of these restless bodies. Quote, my chest flushed at watching boys bronze into adobe kata. A driveway floodlight, the barrio's moon casted their bodies. There is something incredibly touching about this place, so damned that not even the moon dares to touch it. The agency of these boys also shifts. Instead of following God's commands, they willingly partake in the touting, quote, as they place bets, end quote, the poem reads, quote, against the armors they carried, a fist tucked inside a hoodie, his knuckles spelling the names of ex-lovers, each letter tatted with a paper clip, cocked belt buckle whose colors shout to the block who he fucks with. There is a militancy being intimated here, an earnest and careful description of young boys gearing up for war, with all the teeming braggadocio this entails, in the most literal sense of the word, an arms race. But the poem then sinks back to the reality. The poem sobers and parts from party. The poem rehearses the familiar scenes of premature death until asphalt swallows him again, and Maria's na mourn Jesus outside a sagging fence, wreath his chain link with lit candles, cardboard signs saying, we miss you, streamers without the heated balloon that promised flight. Then the poem clears its throat. It offers the third and final triptych to offer another perspective into the city, this city that bleeds. Consider the clothesline as a bandolier. Let's pause on this image of laundry drawn together and hanging, and the poem's request to imagine a bullet strap in the image of the Mexican Revolution. The poem is therefore extrapolating on the militancy of these homeboys and saying that this art of warfare isn't just the reserve of restless youth, but the plight of what this pandemic is calling, quote unquote, essential workers, a term I frankly find insulting, because if they were so pinche essential, they'd be treated as such and not just jeopardized of job and food and home. But I digress. The poem reads, consider the clothesline as a bandolier slung over ruined soldiers whose uniformes still clung onto apartment balconies, quien se dieron sus tierras to raise the wrinkled flags of blusas and neon vests. What is the nationalism of a people without a nation, who left theirs and have been fighting to be part of this one ever since? It is the working class people of East Palo Alto, the community that has been mowing the lawns, painting the houses, cleaning the Stanford floors, that flips the burger patties, the people that move and shake this entire Bay Area peninsula. Having intimated the level of exploitation, the poem reconceptualizes that abuse as sacrifice, a term which often carries religious overtones. Consider this Aztec sacrifice. A father offers an empire his daily flesh, kneels on the melted tar of its tongue, winces at the body turned legal tender. The reference to Aztecs underscores that what is being articulated here is on the scale of civilizations, of world making, is of his own accord. He is offering himself to the empire. It is cyclical, daily, and therefore reverential. He is Christ-like, but the scene of crucifixion is replaced with being swallowed by what I can only describe as a chimera of capital, quote, melted tar of its tongue. The father willingly and knowingly offers himself. He doesn't protest. Only at worst, he lets out a wince, as it says, as he understands his body will be given to the machine of late capitalism. And ladies and gentlemen and gender non-binary folks, that is exactly what my father did. What my father has done ever since he hauled his body under the belly of a smuggler's truck and crossed into this country. Ever since he sunk his teeth into a deep-fried drumstick at a KFC inside a border town safe house, where he and the other undocumented men ate their first American meal. This poem has become an ode to my father, to all the fathers that, quote, nursed their newborns with this vision, una vida mejor, a better life. And so the final scene is not of a street corner turned memorial site. It is not of the three Marias, the aunt, the baby mama, and the virgin mourning Jesus. It is a father, capitalized and of capital, who, quote, cradled my head inside asphalt, prayed for our right to simply wait. Lately, I've been thinking a lot about joy. And by lately, I mean ever since August 3rd, 2019. Ever since a 21-year-old white man drove 600 miles from Dallas to El Paso and calmly walked inside the well-ventilated doors of a Walmart and, aiming his assault rifle, decided to carry out his manifesto against what he called the Hispanic invasion. I have been thinking about how much I and the people who look and talk like me are still hated so much in this country. Black and brown joy, therefore, isn't just some feel-good film, this gratuitous display and hashtag. It is the affirmation that I am indeed a human being. I've also been thinking about the politics of form, about how there are entire English classes on Ulysses or the Odyssey, on a singular author's work, but there isn't one on Oscar Hijuelos, on Reina Grande, on Rigoberto Gonzalez, on Marcelo Hernandez, on Sandra Cisneros. And so part of white supremacy isn't just the explicit violence against brown life, but it's the discrepancy in intellectual scrutiny. That a reader is delighted to hear the romantic sounds of French or the philosophical inquiries of German, and they're both untranslated, but any iota of Spanish, and hyper-literate readers with literally a supercomputer in their pocket throw their hands up and say, well, I just don't know what that means. Can the writer please maybe tell us? And to me, joy is to revel in excess, in overstating, in loudmouth Latinos being themselves on the page. And it is with this self-ode that I read to you my final poem, and will end this lecture, untidy lecture, here. 187 reasons why Mexicanos make the best lovers, after Juan Felipe Herrera. Because we can roll our R's. Because the concept of the apostrophe hasn't seduced us yet. Because my cousin said, hey, that shit looked like ringworm. Because doesn't it sound pathological, an anglophonic tick that hooks the host? Because we ate the host last Sunday anyways. Because all we have is that peasant of prepositions. Because in 1911, Zapata proclaimed the field is to be shared. Because in 2009, CantoMundo proclaimed the field is to be shared. Because Kundiman and Cave Canem tilled it for us. Because Sandra Cisneros said so, okay? Because in the US, my family shared a single mattress. Because to ask for more room, we would simply say, "Haz campo." Because isn't there those seconds afterwards when feet shuffle around bed sheets so you fit too? Because every time I return to my parents' village, the women ask, "¿Eres hijo de Toño y Luisa?" Because we took a language that upon landing in Yucatan demanded our blood. Because 500 years later, we can love skin as white as that day's seafoam. Because it is now us who shore somewhere, Cortez a leather worn at the feet. Because I had a vision of Malinche dragging Hernan on Telemundo. Because Señora Laura shouted in Nahuatl, "Que pase el desgraciado!" Because there's still that one tia who married a gringo. Because transubstantiation is when we turn Will to Güero. Because we have more nicknames than clothes. Because as the first poets of English, we must make this tongue tender. Because the judge sentenced Fabian to life without parole. Because years later, I am still trying to find something beautiful in the idea of courting. Because the neighborhood elotero now accepts Venmo. Because the neighborhood elotero now moved to Fresno. Because Yelp is a proud sponsor of gentrification. Because authentic sounds too much like artifact. Because we sneak sandwiches of aluminum foil into Disneylandia. Because Reynolds Wrap is the only name brand we'll buy. Because we lost all our Tupperware lids. Because the NIH is conducting a longitudinal study on Latina fertility. Because PC stands for Papi Chulo. Because it's not really Freudian when you call me Papi. Because we're really gonna let white people police our beds too. Because Spanish after 9 p.m. ferments to foreplay. Because vino en mi boca doesn't just mean wine in my mouth. Because our rolling is the highest set on the Hitachi wands. Because there's not a single job we'd refuse. Because Google Maps can't find the G-spot. Because at this point in the poem, my mom will run on stage and cut off my mic, or my Zoom mic. Porque ya stop talking about a sex cochino. Because of this Catholic reflex to fear our own pleasure. Because God slept on the 7th. Because we needed the overtime. Because somewhere right now, an aging chente is crooning inside a cantina. Porque las horas más hermosas de mi vida las he pasado al lado de una dama. Because the birthplace of modern democracy is Sábado Gigante. Because the first use of the executive veto was El Chacal's trumpet. Because please give it up for our final contestant, Senator Mitch McConnell. Because he shells at the sounds of aliens screeching, fuera. Because NASA is working to reverse engineer our chisme. 1 second. Oh man, I'm gonna copy that. Because DA stands for Dímelo Amor. Because our citizenship expires faster than peanut butter. Because Hannah Arendt already warned us about the state. Because in 2019, internment camp survivors protested outside a migrant detention center. Because Satsuki Ina of 75 years old said, we are here today to protest the repetition of history. Because the papeles are made of the origami cranes. Because the dreamers might lose theirs in 2020. Because Jared Hoover couldn't buy off our comadres. Because MLA 9th accepts chisme as a reliable source. Because our favorite pastime is irnos con el novio. Because y'all, we just can't keep afford to being anti-black. Because half of us already got curly hair. Because there are 25,000 Blaxicans in LA alone. Because I dream of our grandmother swapping cornbread recipes. Because henceforth, all our marriages will be referred to as jump in the cactus. Because love is political. Because in 2006, the proportion of Latino males in college relative to Latinas was 39%. Because when I was at Duke, it dropped to 31. Because we can't afford to seguir siendo machista. Because the men who ran for exec council were queer. Because the rest of us ran for white girls. Because their boyfriends were shooters dancing to a sonidito. Because ain't it some shit seeing Chad in a MAGA hat yelling, 1, 2, 3, 4. Because the Mexican grito has more streams than Despacito. Because a frat party is still the fastest path to citizenship. Because the BA in my diploma stands for Baby of Anchor. Because US Customs expanded global entry to the Latin lover. Because Eddie Guerrero taunted over the top rope saying, Orale, we can climb over anything, Holmes. Because Juan Dísimo from Fairly Odd Parents is a bad hombre. Because Guillermo from Jimmy Kimmel is still a good one. Because either way, we're still sidekicks. Because the official term for 3 Mexicans or more is a gossip. Because all gossip begins with the words, Televisa presenta. Because hummingbirds flutter in our rib cage. Because the family therapist was Walter Mercado. Porque Leo, tú eres el rey absoluto de Zodiaco, rey de corazones. Because next year's English exam will be written entirely in albur. Because the only thing we'll cheat on is a New Year's resolution. Because the BMI test isn't curved to our bodies. Because half of Mexico is in a long distance relationship with their husbands. Because before WhatsApp, there were postal calling cards. Because I wonder how much grief AT&T has heard. Because Theo Luis never let me open the gray felt box in our shared room. Because contracts are the only is a Sonoran desert. Because shouldn't all those white crosses be canonized? Because this is why we have so many saints. Because aren't we the gods of waiting? Because visa is short for me avisas cuando cruces. Because we've plotted an international conspiracy to marry our way into this country. Because Mary is our mother's name. Because the strategy came to us watching The Little Mermaid. Because the sea is a testament to how ice can melt. Because Ariel reminds us of Rocío Dúrcal, because she'd hurl her body between ours and King Triton's trident. Because Daddy, I love him. Because Disney cut out what she said afterwards. Because I know he's the one. Because we've dug a tunnel to the southern wall of Atlanta. Because we secretly long for white people to love us back. Because the G in GDP stands for ganas. Because in Spanish, poverty rhymes with promise. People take Don Ramon over Romeo any day. Because when Juliet plunged the sword, Apá said, she killed herself? For him? What a pendeja. Because we don't have warring families, only countries. Because our love is decolonial. Because it took your parents surviving a civil war, mine's the belly of a smuggler's truck, for us to kiss under an English sky. Because we made it official outside the Foreign Office. Because the rest of the cohort was still inside. Gays in this poem has been deported to La Chingada. Because Univision already bought the rights to our story. Because rom-com is short for romantic commonwealth. Because under what genre is ethnic reclaiming? Because Eepert and Ropert were an election committee. Because isn't watching the children of immigrants get drunk inside the former halls of empire riveting? Because my mother pronounces Plato's cave as un plato. Because never forget, the Marshall Scholarship needs us, not the other way around. Because never forget, the Marshall Scholarship needs us, not the other way around. Because never forget, Duke University needs us, not the other way around. Because never forget, this country needs us, not the other way around. Because I don't know about you, but this class of mobility is giving me whiplash, yo. Because Apá kissed his teeth. Hubiera sido que te solven, Tony. Because when they housed us in DC, how many of the housekeepers had your mother's accent? Because this house is still burning, even if we've moved up a couple floors. Because la telenovela se llamará País Nublado. Porque tu pelo captured the sun. Because this is why London fogs. Because your knees buckled when I held you outside the telephone booth. Because my kryptonite was a pair of hoop earrings. Because Los Angeles isn't a city, but the wings that carried us here. Because tostadas go bomb with Salvadorian. Because Poetry TMZ ain't fucking ready. Because, ooh, Jose Olivares liked our post. Because swipe left to see your hand on my chest. Because how are you going to attack Jose in the comments, though? Because in lieu of a birth certificate, we received a master's of drama. Because I dream of our brown asses bien abrazaditos at the National Book Awards. Because how many of us have stood on red carpets and not had to clean them? Because at the award ceremony, I'll dim the lights so no one else sees us. Because the white gaze is now a permanent resident of La Chingada. Because there I'll read your grandmother's caliche. Porque vos me mariposas. Because you fluttered when I asked, how many kids do you want to mentor? Because a line break is your bated breath. Because along the south bank your mouth short, como río contigo. Because I heard, how a river with you. Because I pray my book jackets will keep our people warm. Because the people of the previous line has outgrown Chicano nationalism. Because I am tired of poems where people are always running. Because I dream of an independent film where we walk through the streets of Brixton. Because we'll call it South Central with you. Because select theaters will sell elotes con crema. Porque hasta tu papá me presume. Because if the Carters took the Louvre, we'll take the British Museum. Because the Tate Modern was already booked with an exhibition of Sandinistas. Because I've never seen headshots of our people without bullets. Because I'm afraid that at the stroke of 12, this gala will end. Because the day without an immigrant protest in '06 or a nationwide quinceañera. Because the Chambelan senators never showed up. Because the surprise dance was a raised consciousness. Because aren't we priests too, restless to baptize our people inside fonts of canon? Because the Latinx is our time's new Roman. Because hands first dunked our head inside a tres leches cake. Because we've learned to watch our backs ever since. Porque el día que tú naciste, nacieron todas las flores. Because the conversion rate for dating us is 1 to 20 months. Because 17 of those is our mothers doing their hair. Because loving each other is the only peso that won't collapse. Because in August, a young couple from El Paso proved this. Because the peso of Andrea and Chondo took the gunman's bullet. Because the peso of his wife Jordan took its shrapnel. Because the shrapnel was of a presidential rally 3 months prior. Because these 2 pesos saved their 2-month-old. Because Walmart doesn't save, we do. Because this poem refuses to use the word dead. Because publish their names, not mine. Because Arturo Benavides, 60. Javier Rodriguez, 15. Leo Campos, 41. Maribel Hernandez, 56. Raúl Flores, 83. María Flores, 77. Elsa Márquez, 57. Luis Alfonso Juárez, 90. Sara Regalado Moriel, 66. Adolfo Hernández, 68. Jorge García, 61. Elsa Mendoza Márquez, age unknown. Gloria Imer Márquez, age unknown. María Eugenia Roth, my aunt's name, 56. Juan Velázquez, 77. Ivan Manzano, 46. Teresa Sanchez, 82. Because we have a heart that sings Amor Eterno and feet that tread these fields of wreath. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you so much, Antonio. That was very moving. Well, I'd like to open it